My guest today is Marc Morano. And Marc, take it away.
Well, thank you for having me on here, Tom. Last time I was on, I believe we talked climate, energy, and I touched on the Great Reset, or at least climate lockdowns. But this time I'm debuting my new focus, which I believe all roads go through essentially to understand what's happening in climate, energy, COVID policy, all goes through what we call the Great Reset, because this is really a systematic, widespread, not a secret, and everything I'm about to tell you today about the Great Reset is not based on some secret document. I can't show you the source, or I obtained these documents from some organization, or there's a recording, or I have a report from anonymous, or I got a Greenpeace blog and I'm extrapolating and making a mountain out of a molehill. Everything I'm about to show you is from mainstream sources. So your viewers can actually look and see the source. Bloomberg News, the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the UK Guardian. You'll be able to see these are big corporate mainstream entities. Those are my sources here. So this is not some secret cabal that, he had shadowy things and he wasn't providing his sources. You'll see as we go forward here. The Great Reset came out in August of last year. And this book was my opus, if you will. I did The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change 2018. I guess it was updated 2018 with the Green New Deal. And then I did Green Fraud, which came out in 2021. And then I did 2019 was the Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change with the Green New Deal. 2021, I did the Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Worse Than You Think. And in 2022, I came out with the Great Reset, which I think really ties it all together. So I'm going to try to capture in layman's term for everyone to understand my presentation on what I believe the Great Reset is and the key points here. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. Let me just go back a little bit about who I am. The picture with me in the wanted posters from the UN Paris climate meeting in 2015. That's on the streets of Paris. That was an attempt to intimidate me. That was the day of my premiere of Climate Hustle. We had it in I guess 150-year-old theater in Paris. And of course, they sent all these climate protesters down and they had to shut us down for a couple hours when police cleared them out. A lot of fun. We had the late Fred Singer there in person. We had Patrick Moore. We had Bob Carter. We had Willie Soon. We had a whole slew of the scientists who appeared in our film. And we had a proper red carpet, step and repeat, Hollywood style premiere. And that's what they tried to do. So they put up the wanted posters the day before. The other picture next to it where I'm wearing the red MAGA hat, that's in the UN Climate Summit in Marrakesh, Morocco, 2016, just 2 weeks after President Trump won election. Actually, it may only been a week. It was like the early November, maybe the week after the election. And what I did, and I got arrested and thrown out and detained and my book bag seized and deplatformed and canceled and thrown out of the UN by armed United Nations climate cops. But what happened there, you can see the picture at the top there. That's the armed United Nations climate cops escorting me and Craig Rucker out of the building. But I did two things. I said, Donald Trump, I had a cardboard cutout, which you see there of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not going to honor the UN Paris Agreement. And so I started shredding it. I had a paper shredder. And of course, all hell broke loose. And I was immediately reported to the UN authorities. I didn't even get, probably only about 2 minutes in. This made it on the international loop. CNN had me on every half hour, being essentially arrested at the UN Climate Summit. So I put some of that in. The picture below that is at the UN Climate Summit in Egypt this past year. We did a no net zero protest. We went and glued ourselves to some priceless art in an Egyptian museum in Cairo to say no more no net zero policies, and we have to end this. We did a reverse that. And that's me debating Bill Nye, and that's me and Rush Limbaugh. Worked on his TV show. There's me and Geraldo and Hannity, and there's me on Piers Morgan. Anyway, so that's my background. And you can go, my website is climatedepot.com, CVEC Climate Depot, which, by the way, I will be debuting the first visual update to my 1990s technology website, Climate Depot, probably in the next couple of weeks here. It's going to have similar formatting, but finally I think I'll be entering the 2000s. I'll be leaving the 90s at least. I still like to go the low-tech, simplified way to read. But anyway, okay, the World Economic Forum. What is the Great Reset? I was called by Media Matters for America, the Soros-funded group, a Great Reset conspiracy theorist. And I've had a lot of fun. I mean, with Tucker Carlson, was on many times talking about the Great Reset. And I was on Dan Bongino's show. I've been on Fox and Friends. And I'm trying to get in a way that's non-conspiratorial, because this isn't a conspiracy. I mean, if it's a conspiracy, it's a conspiracy reality. It's not a conspiracy theory. So I've been having a lot of fun with that. But the Great Reset, World Economic Forum, first used the phrase 2014. And this was when they really ripped into it, though. This was in June. This quote here is from June of 2020. Pandemic represents narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, reset our world. The WEF founder, Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum started in 1971. And his great claim to the world is the development of what we call stakeholder capitalism, which is sort of a version of the precursor to ESG. And the idea is no longer do businesses, private companies ever have to answer to shareholders, efficiency, a product or service, or the customers for their goods and services. They have to essentially bow to a progressive social agenda, which of course translates today to transgender, critical race, climate, energy, ideology. And your company, what's most important in order to get funding, favorable interest rates, are to get that type of stakeholder capitalism view of the world. And that's really where he came. And his other claim to fame, this is important on Klaus Schwab, he did what this annual Davos meeting was very important. He was able to bring millionaires, billionaires, royal family, presidents, prime ministers, cabinet officials, senators, congressmen, corporate titans, all in one venue, off the record, no recorded. So what you could have corporations and billionaires and millionaires meeting with presidents and cabinets and senators and Congress, all off the books. In other words, if you wanted to have these same meetings in a state legislature in the U.S. Congress, then you have to start looking at visitor logs, and you have to start looking at all sorts of lobbying rules and restrictions and what you serve. But this is just sort of off the books, free for all. You can have Bill Gates talking to Warren Buffett, talking to the president of France, talking to Prince Charles, then Prince Charles. And this is how he became a sort of an integral part of this, to the point now, and this is important, Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, at the last, I think it was G20 summit, it was in Indonesia last maybe September, October, he was feted as a head of state. There he was with President Macron, President Biden, walking on the stage, introduced on the same level as that. That's the importance of Klaus Schwab. So the Great Reset, according to the World Economic Forum, this video was actually released well before COVID, is the video. I took screenshots. You'll own nothing and be happy. This is what their basic vision is. Whatever you want, you'll rent, and it'll be delivered by drone. And they go through great detail if you read some of the supporting material. They have essays explaining that you will live in an apartment that you don't have to pay for, because when you leave during the day, a business will rent it for meeting spaces, and you won't have to own any appliances, because if you want, say, a blender, you can just order it up on an app, and then suddenly a drone will deliver it within 30 minutes, and then you'll be on your way, and then when you're done, the drone will pick it up. They have a vision, and you could call it a arrogance, if you will, or conceit, that they have, that they will have such technological advancement that they'll just be able to snap their fingers. It's a utopian world vision that this world will work that way. So you'll own nothing and be happy. But keep in mind, someone will own something and someone is not going to be happy. And the people who will own things are the same people who were pushing the climate restrictions and the COVID lockdowns, the billionaires and the millionaires, and the forces of what's essentially a neo-feudalistic system of the global system, which is what they're trying to impose. The U.S. won't be the leading superpower. Boy, that's happening rapidly, as we see, not even to the point where we're watching the petrodollar collapse. We're watching our foreign policy escapades destroying the United States, and we're watching our energy dominance wither away, and we're watching our economy being deeply embedded with inflation and debt and the printing of nonstop money under modern monetary theory. Well, there'll be a global price on carbon. This climate is a big key part of the World Economic Forum. You will be eating meat limited. Meat will be an occasional treat, not a staple, for the good of our environment and for our health. So the Great Reset is the intentional, and this is what build back better. Remember, you're collapsing everything and then you're building back better, which is another word for Great Reset. intentional collapse of our energy to the point where you have Obama administration officials in the past have said that the high skyrocketing energy prices are good to help impose the climate agenda. So it's the intentional collapse of energy, food, transportation, free speech, property ownership, and our financial system. So I've talked to people and they say, well, they'll never achieve this. Their goal isn't really to achieve the utopian vision that I'm laying out, that they've laid out. Their goal is to create chaos, make everything miserable so that they can then gain more and more power, and they'll be able to essentially take over industries. There's already massive calls for nationalization of energy because the market forces have failed. We've already seen what's happened in free speech. Misinformation is considered a public health threat during COVID. So you've got to ban, deplatform, defund, censor people. Property ownership as one of their big goals. The United Nations actually had the Vancouver Declaration, which I'll get to later, actually said that private property ownership leads to inequity, racism, and all these other hosts of societal ills. So they're against, just on the face of it, the idea that the masses, you and I, Tom, can own property. I mentioned the financial system, transportation, food, eating bugs, collapse of high-yield agriculture, transportation, banning of gas-powered cars. And the key is none of this is up for a vote. Now, you could argue energy by voting for Biden, you voted for restrictions. But remember, when people vote for the green agenda, whether it was voting for Arnold Schwarzenegger back when he was governor of California, they were voting for a painless, and Al Gore used to talk about this, it's going to be painless, solar and wind are cheaper, and it's going to be great, and we're going to have cleaner air, we're going to have plentiful energy, and it's going to be this wonderful, the Green New Deal was billed as this awesome thing. But when the reality hits, when you have energy shortages and skyrocketing prices, and you see all the banning of appliances with nothing to replace it, and just generally imposing a misery, and they're going after our freedom of movement with airline travel and gas-powered cars, and a whole host of all the food restrictions, be it on meat, be it on high-yield agriculture, creating an intentional food crisis. This is done to put them in power. They're not actually going to achieve this utopian vision, but they're going to achieve chaos. Why do they want chaos? Well, let's go back. 1919, Vladimir Lenin used the phrase, this is Christian Science Monitor, the long shadow of Vladimir Lenin's slogan, the worse is better. And the slogan was, during Tsarist Russia, was to cheer on the chaos and destruction of the existing order to essentially be able to impose your new reset or build back better. That's literally the method. They want this chaos. And it's also why they're trying to divide us over critical race, transgender. They want us arguing over those kind of things. Well, the real things are happening behind the scenes. They want to divide Americans and Europeans and global citizens, actually. I hate the phrase global citizens, but they want to divide people of the world over all these little arguments while they do the big con or the long con. So COVID is very integral into this. In fact, the Great Reset by the World Economic Forum was a vision, but they really put it into action in March of 2020. And I'll say this, Donald Trump's greatest failing as a president. In fact, the greatest failing of any president in 50 years was Donald Trump going along with Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx. We know now that Deborah Birx in her book admitted they duped Donald Trump to go along with the 2 days or 10 weeks or two weeks to flatten the curve. That led to the greatest presidential blunder in 50 plus years. In my lifetime, I can't think of anything that was a greater blunder than that, because it set that precedent. It gave emergency powers to the government, and it allowed unelected, no one voted, school closures, business closures, stay-at-home orders from governors, canceling of weddings, funerals, canceling of medical procedures, screening procedures, kids out of school, mask mandates, vax mandates. It led to all of that. Even if that didn't happen, especially the vax mandates didn't happen under Trump because there wasn't a vaccine yet until Biden came in. But how did all this happen? It happened without a single vote of democracy. It was imposed upon us. And that was the excitement. That's why Jane Fonda at one point said that COVID was God's gift to the left. And I'll get to that in a minute, because it gave them essentially a way to impose their agenda without having to worry about that nasty little thing we call democracy. So the World Health Organization is an evil player here. This is actual headline. This is from a European mainstream corporate media. Copy China's response to COVID-19. The WHO urges the rest of the world. And the date on this is February 26, 2020. They didn't even know if China had done anything with the virus yet. This was during the time when people were dropping dead in the streets, and you had the Chinese out there in the hazmat suits. But the World Health Organization was trusting China's thing, and they told the world, let's go. The Western world needs to have an unprecedented lockdown of its citizens. And so the once free West, and this happened, then it went to Italy, and then it came to the United States. The once free West lusted after Chinese one-party rule. Again, that bypassing a democracy, imposing what you think is right for the citizens. Well, let's do a little history lesson of this sort of love affair. I'm not necessarily knocking China here. I'm saying it's not about whether China is good or bad. It's the fact that the ruling class of America, Europe, and our Western world drooled after the same power that China had with a one-party democracy is what they call it. This is one-party democracy. Tom Friedman, pages of the New York Times, not said in some off-the-cuff interview. He said, quote, one-party autocracy has its drawbacks, but at China, it's led by a reasonably enlightened group of people. It also has great advantages. One party can just impose the politically difficult but critically important policies needed to move a society forward in the 20th century. So that's a praise. The United Nations climate chief, Christina Figueres, lamented U.S. democracy as detrimental to the war on global warming, and it would also be detrimental to the war on a virus. She lauded one-party ruled China for doing it right on climate. So here you have New York Times, UN. Apple CEO has praised China. He said that China aligns completely with Apple's values on climate. He defended China as, quote, very fixated on doing the right things to avert climate change. So you see where they loved China. U.S. Energy Secretary Granholm, this was earlier this year, just 2 months ago, claimed U.S. can learn from what China is doing on climate change. So all of this learning from China. So it's no surprise that the World Health Organization actually said, copy China, and our ruling class, our corporate media, our academia, our government leaders, our bureaucracy, and all the Western world were like, yeah, China's great. We've been wanting to be like them for decades, and now's our chance. Let's copy China. That's literally what happened. And I'm just touching the surface. I go much deeper into this in my book. The Great Billionaire Reset. So what happened when they did, by the way, I don't have it here, but one other thing to mention is Justin Trudeau also said he had basic admiration for China's dictatorship. He said this in like 2013. That's important for what he later did in Canada. The Great Billionaire Reset. This is incredible. This is, I believe this is Yahoo News and Let, but workers lost $3.7 trillion in earnings during the lockdowns, not a pandemic, it was lockdowns. And world billionaires got richer by $3.9 trillion. So somehow the world, I think they printed money. That's how they got that extra, $0.2 trillion thrown at them. The billionaires actually made out better than the poor and middle class lost. So 3.7 and 3.8 was literally the largest transfer of wealth from poor and middle class to the wealthy. Think of the Great Reset. You'll own nothing but to be happy. They also say you'll have no privacy. Life will never be better. Well, who's going to own it all? That massive transfer of wealth. All the mom and pop restaurants and small businesses crushed. Well, corporate America thrived, from Amazon to Facebook to Zoom, all the big tech companies. The retail chains were much better able to survive than the smaller businesses. And that's how you get a more compliant and colluding corporate world, by making them power, and you crush the small mom and pops. Whether it's in agriculture, you crush the small farms. Whether it's in business, you crush it, because they're the least likely to go along with the ESG, environment, social governance, and all the woke industry. The pandemic created a billionaire every 30 hours as millions braced for extreme poverty. Now, I sound like Bernie Sanders here, but this is important. This was government-created policy that made this happen overnight. This wasn't the Reagan tax cuts that caused this. Australia, this was interesting because Australia, next to China, was probably the most authoritarian country, then followed by Canada and then maybe New Zealand. There was a lot of competition for that, but Australia was probably next to China, the single one of that. Maybe Canada passed it when Trudeau cracked down on the trucker freedom convoy. But Australian authorities can use any force necessary. This was under their COVID emergency powers. They can break into any building, structure, vehicle using whatever force necessary. This is from Australian corporate news. Direct or prohibit movement of people, animals, or vehicles, put people in quarantine, order people to undergo medical exams, tests, or treatment. And these are ordered. You don't have a choice. So you had a track and trace app in Australia. If you went into a grocery store, got yourself, went home, everything was great. 6 hours later, you could get a page saying you were next to someone within 5 feet of someone in the checkout line who later tested positive for COVID. Guess where you're headed without any choice? To a quarantine camp for 8, 10, 12 days, whatever the local authorities determine. And you were forced into these camps in Australia. Who would want to live in a quarantine camp? Well, Bill Gates. And again, this is NBC News. Bill Gates, if every country did what Australia did, the world could prevent the next pandemic. Now, this is Bill Gates using the most authoritarian country next to China as the model forward. This is what Bill Gates is saying. Why should we give a flying F what Bill Gates thinks? Well, there's a reason for that. Bill Gates, depending on how you look at it, I used to think he was a number 2 funder of the World Health Organization, but he also controls Gavi. And if you combine Gavi and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and in more recent years, people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. now claim Bill Gates is the number 1 funder of the World Health Organization, which they're then working on a pandemic treaty, which I'll get to as well. You can have global instant lockdowns. That sounds great. So Bill Gates is arguing that we should go for that. Now, when you are talking about what they're forced on us, now Donald Trump's other big mistake, in addition to being duped for the lockdowns, well, 2 other mistakes. I'll tell you what. One was rushing a vaccine, but the other one is he won't own up to the fact that he declared the emergency of COVID in March of 2020, that he allowed the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, which urged governors to shut down all businesses, and he was duped by Fauci. He now pretends as though somehow Ron DeSantis is the bad guy and wasn't. And Ron DeSantis did fall for the lockdowns early. The only state that didn't, by the way, was South Dakota. And don't credit Kristi Noem. It was the South Dakota legislator who refused to allow any lockdown. If you look back, Kristi Noem actually tried to lock the state down, realized she couldn't do it under their structure. She couldn't just do like many states, declare the emergency, or chose not to at the last minute. But the legislator saved South Dakota. But pretty much everyone early on fell into it except South Dakota. But Donald Trump won't acknowledge that he was one of the biggest lockdown proponents and set this whole thing up with this emergency powers. Anyway, so what he also did was Operation Warp Speed. And that's the last thing you want to do is rush an untested mRNA vaccine on the public. And it did many things because of the emergency use authorization because of trying to get this vaccine in. You couldn't have any alternative medicine work, or it would no longer qualify for a rush approval by the public health bureaucrats. So this is where you got to the absurd thing of things like CVS and Walgreens telling, hey, we can't honor your doctor's thing. This is misinformation. Your doctor has no business prescribing you whatever else medicine they were trying. They literally shut down corporate voices that see at all these big pharmacies and drug chains. Literally would not allow doctors' prescriptions to be filled because it went against the government narrative. And I include this is important, flashback to fertility panic because of overpopulation fears. This is back 1969, New York Times, sterility drug in food is hinted, and it's about Paul Ehrlich. Biologist stresses need to curb population growth. The great work of Tony Heller, not only did Paul Ehrlich advocate the sterility drug in Africa, but in a few years later, he advocated it even in the West, in the United States. Tony Heller, I remember, found those. It was incredible research. So here you have 1969 telling people that there's an overpopulation crisis and we need things to prevent population. Then you had, this is Carl Rowan, African-American columnist for the Evening News. Blacks fear population control is genocide. He used Paul Ehrlich's hidden sterility agent in water to prevent people from reproducing as a reason why African Americans and Blacks did not trust government public health research, going back to the Tuskegee experiments. So that's one of the things. The other thing that happened here is the word anti-vax was redefined. This is Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And look at the newer definition of anti-vax. It's not someone who opposes vaccines. It's a person who opposes the regulations mandating vaccination. So you could have every COVID vaccine, every booster, all 6, 8, whatever we're up to, and you could still be considered anti-vax if you don't support vaccine mandates, according to the new dictionary definition. They're literally redefining words. Justin Trudeau in Canada, the man who praised China, we're going to, basic admiration, he said, we're going to end this pandemic by proceeding with vaccination. And he went on to say that people who didn't get the vaccine were essentially didn't believe in science. They were misogynistic. They were racist. They take up space. And he says, do we tolerate these people? This is the kind of thing we were dealing with during these frightening days. Bill Maher, who's one of my heroes, I have a whole chapter devoted to left of center people, from Jimmy Dore to Russell Brand to Naomi Wolf to RFK Jr. to Bill Maher to Glenn Greenwald, all who were essentially red-pilled and stood up not only against this COVID mandates, but also against the free speech and the misinformation things they were trying to impose upon us, the free speech restrictions. Bill Maher said of Justin Trudeau, I thought he was kind of a cool guy. Then I started to read what he said. It's like, tolerate the unvaccinated? Now you do sound like Hitler. So this is Bill Maher. I'm not violating Godwin's law. Bill Maher is here, comparing him to Hitler. The vaccines became a huge effort in terms of control as a weapon, as part of this whole Great Reset, which again was triggered again, reactivated in June of 2020 by the World Economic Forum after the lockdowns kicked in March, so just 2 months after. Drivers must present COVID certificates in order to refuel cars. There were countries where you couldn't even access your own bank account unless you got the vaccine. This then leads to the central bank digital currency, which I deal with in my book, A Great Reset, as well. And this is, again, UK Telegraph. Again, I just want you to know that I'm not citing even a Ron Paul newsletter or something. This is the UK Telegraph. The Bank of England tells the ministers to intervene on digital currency programming. Well, what's programming? Digital cash can be programmed to ensure it's only spent on essentials or that which the employer or government deems to be sensible. So people are, hey, this is great. It's all efficient. It's going to be wonderful. It's being sold as this great idea, central bank digital currency. Here in the United States, Joe Biden has issued a central bank digital currency. The United States is rapidly moving as fast as possible to this. So imagine you want to run your air conditioner cold. You want to buy more gas for your car. You want to buy beef. You want to travel, buy an airline ticket. Hey, it's not sensible. We're in a climate emergency. That's the level of control that they're pushing at this moment. All of this since March 2020 has accelerated my entire world of watching the climate energy debate transformed overnight because everything was happening at fast break speed. The CO2 monitoring card, along with this central bank digital currency, ESG, you had the UN and MasterCard join forces to come up with a credit card. This exists, monitors and cuts off your spending when you hit your carbon max. World Economic Forum praised this because it actually cuts off your ability to spend money. So again, if you're buying too many train tickets or buying too much gas for your car, you bought a plane ticket, or you bought meat for a big barbecue, that's all going to be calculated, and they're going to say, no, you can't spend that money. But okay, it's voluntary. MasterCard's a private company. How can you get involved? What are you, a fascist? I mean, what are you, a socialist? You don't want private companies? This is not about private companies. This is corporate government collusion throughout the board. It's also international organization, UN collusion with corporations and World Economic Forum. But this is how they're trying to get us. Government and employers only what you deem what you have sensible. I believe right now, Bank of America, if I'm not mistaken, their card, you can't buy guns or ammunition on it because they don't believe that that's just for a society. This is the key point. Then, of course, we talked about free speech. Big tech censorship is government censorship. And I make that point throughout the book. The collusion, we saw this during COVID between CDC, big tech. It was incredible. Everything from the Barrington Declaration, the dissenting scientists who went against the COVID lockdowns. And by the way, as you and I both know, Tom, it's easy to get a consensus of scientists when you silence, censor, deplatform, and cancel the scientists who dissent. So of course, they're all going to agree. One of the things Biden did is he had an EPA science advisory board when he was first elected. He literally went in and cleaned out over 50 scientists who were appointed by Donald Trump or even previous presidents who he didn't think were going to go along with their EPA agenda. He literally just booted them out and then replaced them with scientists he knew would agree. So guess what? Within 6 months of cleaning this out, every proposal the Biden EPA does, they can credibly say, all scientists agree with our policies. Our advisory board is 100% consensus. It's not even 97%. And you're like, wow, that's impressive. These must be good mainstream policies. No, it's not impressive. They literally cleaned out any potential dissenting scientists. And of course, they all agree. So that's what big tech censorship, it is government censorship. It was the Biden White House, the deep state, the CIA, the FBI would tell big tech, go after this guy, delete this, get that. We've seen the freedom of information. And these big tech would be like, yes, they're gone. We've gotten rid of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We're going after Joseph McCall. Whatever they wanted. This was not. This was government farming out censorship, to their violation of the First Amendment to corporate America. I love this quote. This was done at the anniversary of Voice of America by John F. Kennedy. I believe it was 1962 or 3. I really need to include the date here. But my favorite, we should not be afraid to entrust Americans with unpleasant facts, foreign ideas, or competitive values. This is the best quote. For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people. And that is the bottom line. Whenever you hear a ministry of truth, a fact check, or that's misinformation, that is what they're trying to do, is they're trying to control that because they don't want people. They're afraid to let people judge what's truth or falsehood. Why can't we hear what RFK Jr. has to say about vaccines? Why can't we hear what Naomi Wolf had to say? Why can we only hear? We've reached a point in America, in the once free West, where literally you can't have an opinion that's different from whatever the official government narrative is. And that includes on climate, on COVID, on everything from public health to even gun violence or whatever, gun control. If you disagree, you're de facto misinforming and you're telling a falsehood. And all of these people out there, all these fact checks are just consensus enforcers. It's the most incredible thing. So this was a speech, and I actually did a whole separate speech in Orlando at Heartland Institute on just this, and I'm actually working up a big report on this, a written report. But all I really needed to know about COVID, I learned during the climate debate. And there's a book, 1985, All I Need to Know About Life, basically you learned in kindergarten. Well, I changed it and said the climate debate, because here's what I learned. In the climate debate, I learned activists want you to panic, and that's Greta Thunberg. And why do they want you to panic? Because when you panic, you don't make rational, sound decisions. You allow people to come in and take your freedom away because you're panicked and worried and afraid. So in the COVID debate, I also learned that activists want you to panic. Neil Ferguson literally did, the virus modeler from UK, literally followed the climate template. You make get a model and make a big scary prediction of the future, and you tell everyone certain doom is going to happen unless you go full Marxist, unless we do these draconian government restrictions. He was literally following the James Hansen, the Greenpeace, the United Nations playbook to a T. Bill Gates warned COVID could kill over 30 million people. We had to lock down. We had to give up our freedom. We had to mask our kids. We had to stay at home orders. We had to rat on our neighbors if they had barbecues or backyard parties because we were going to die unless we did this. In the COVID debate, billionaires bought the media. Checkbook journalism bought and paid for. NPR announced that Facebook's Zuckerberg and Rockefeller will be funding NPR's climate desk. You're going to get top of the line, good balanced reporting there. AP announced the largest single expansion of climate reporting paid through philanthropic grants of $8 million. So in the climate debate, billionaires bought the media. Guess what? In the COVID debate, billionaires bought the media. Bill Gates pumped tens of millions of dollars for positive media. Everything from NPR to ABC. You'll never see Bill Gates ever be asked a really hostile question because these are paid media appearances that he's paid his darn a lot of money, and they better be nice interviews to him. Another thing I learned, in climate, the UN governments are your single source of truth. The UN declared back in fall of 2022, we own the science. And the world should know it, said the UN spokesman. So we partnered with Google to ensure only UN climate results appear. Wow. So in climate, the government was a single source of truth. Guess what? In COVID, the WHO and governments were the single source of truth. This is actual quote from Jacinda Ardern. Take all non-government information with a grain of salt, dismiss everything else. In other words, only your government you can trust. You can't trust Harvard, Nobel Prize winning scientists, any dissenters who signed, any who were opposed to lockdowns or mandates or masking. Government advice, we will continue to be your single source of truth, the government. And that's it. If you don't believe the government's the only one that can tell you the truth. Dr. Fauci said anyone who questions the public health guidance was questioning science itself because he represented the science. In the climate debate, Big Al Gore, a Big Al, Google track your every move. Al Gore has now satellites partnering with Google, and I want to get the exact number. I think it's 80,000, well, 11,000 ground-based, air, sea-based sensors. I thought it was like 80,000 satellites in the sky now to detect all emissions from every factory and farm, to keep track, just to monitor. No, there's no mandates yet. So Big Al traces you in the climate debate. Guess what? In the government, in the COVID debate, big government tracked your every move. The CDC tracked millions of phones to see if Americans were following lockdown orders. And you had the track and trace apps done by the same people who pushed the climate. A company that was pushing the climate agendas with the World Economic Forum became big in the track and trace app of the COVID world. So climate lockdowns. This is the future that they want. This was incredible. I was doing research on this, and I believe I didn't have this the last time we talked, Tom, but shutting down the whole economy is the only way of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This was the UN top official, former head of the UNFCCC in 2013, Ivo de Boer, announced this, that we had to shut down. Basically, he was saying it in more of a kind of like, we'll never get there because it would require shutting down the whole world. But guess what? 2021, oh, actually, I don't, shoot. Okay. But anyway, 2019, November 2019, sorry, let me go back. November 2019, the UN said the global emissions had to drop 7% in order to meet the UN Paris agreements. By December of 2020, guess what global emissions had dropped? 7.4%. They even did better than they wanted. And that was how you basically say, we had to shut down the economy. They did shut down the economy. They got their goal. And then you had the UK Guardian come out and say, we need a lockdown, every COVID-style lockdown every 2 years in order to meet the UN climate goals. So they've really laid that out. And I'm sorry I don't have that screen here shot here, but those are all, again, mainstream sources with the UN press release and the UK Guardian. Now, I was interviewed by UK Channel 4. I've been called the Great Reset conspiracy theorist. He's a climate lockdown conspiracy theorist. This is a Bill Gates, George Soros-funded professor, Mariana Mazzucato, University College London, in September of 2020. Guess who used and coined the phrase climate lockdown? A Bill Gates, George Soros-funded professor. Not me, not some right-wing climate denier, but the people that are funded by the organs of our mainstream and establishment. In the near future, the world may need to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle a climate emergency. Under a climate lockdown, governments would limit private vehicle use, ban consumption of red meat, impose extreme energy-saving measures, while fossil fuel companies would have to stop drilling. To avoid such a scenario, we must overhaul economic structures and do capitalism differently. Gee, that's a Bill Gates, George Soros-funded professor in September of 2020, sounding an awfully lot like the Great Reset and using the phrase climate lockdown. Again, not a conspiracy theory. I didn't make it up. Senator Chuck Schumer has urged Joe Biden to declare a national climate emergency. Why? Well, other people have done the same thing, AOC and Senator Markey. Well, why do they want a national climate emergency? Joe Biden would be granted 130 new executive powers under a climate emergency. This was the Center for Biological Diversity. It triggers 130 different powers, and it goes through. It would basically then extend to governors and mayors. And we're already seeing this happening at many local levels. We have states and cities banning the creation of new gas stations now. The idea of being that, the earth can't handle it, and they're using their local authority. A lot of these places have declared climate emergencies, a lot of cities. And so what happens there, even if you can still get a gas-powered car, even if you can get a loan for one, which corporate banks are saying they don't want to do it, give you a car loan, you're going to face gas station shortages. But that's the kind of thing they can do odd, even days. They can order no cars on the road. They can these powers are going to be very similar to COVID-like powers. And Joe Biden almost declared this in the summer of 2022. But what happened was Joe Manchin came through for him, and Joe Manchin literally gave him the Inflation Reduction Act, so they held off. But there's talk that because Joe Biden is a lame duck now with the Republican Congress, that he might go back and declare a national climate emergency. That's something to watch out for. So remember, the Gates Soros-funded professor, Mariana Mazzucato, came up with the phrase climate lockdown. She said here, I mean, not he, but the International Energy Agency, this was followed up, this was 2021 report. Net Zero report urged behavioral changes to fight climate change. Listen to, so mimicking what the Gates Soros-funded professor said, shift away from private car use, upper speed limits, thermostat controls in your house, limits on your hot water. Keep in mind, this is all happening as we speak. They're banning gas-powered cars. They're questioning car. I'll get to that private car ownership. Thermostat controls. We had in Colorado, the utility shutting off people's thermostats during a heat wave because people were turning it too cold. And these are people who have signed up for a smart meter and didn't realize they were turning that kind of power over to the utility. UK-funded 2019 report called Absolute Zero urged climate lockdowns. Here's what they say. They're all so repetitive, all telling us in bold messages. And this isn't some obscure report. Oh, what is this? Absolute Zero. This was a UK-funded government report. I poured over the pages of debate, and the UK government with the members, I think it was the House of Commons or the House of Lords, and I'm not sure exactly which one had the big debate. They went over this report, and none of the conservative or the non-big government party ever challenged the premise. They just thought, oh, this is maybe a little too far. We can go a little lighter. Kind of reminds me of our House leadership here, Kevin McCarthy, who says climate is a problem and we have a solution. We're going to plant trees and capture carbon. We don't want to be against the earth. We're all for the climate. We believe climate's a problem. We're not deniers. Oh, great. Republicans leading once again on Capitol Hill. Same thing happened in UK. But this report urged stop flying, no new roads, airport closures, stop eating beef and lamb, stop doing anything that causes emissions. The last one here is chilling. Regulate CO2 similar to asbestos. Now, we inhale oxygen as humans, we exhale carbon dioxide. They're turning our human breath into asbestos regulation. Imagine what you can do when you get to that. Now, keep in mind, they already went after our human breath with the forced masking globally all over the world, and they would never have given that up. Here in the United States, it took one Trump-appointed judge, almost 2 years, federal judge, to strike down the unconstitutional mandate that you had to wear a mask when flying or on trains or buses. That's how long this crap takes, but this is what they want to do to us. So the journal Nature, again, not a Greenpeace blog, not a Friends of the Earth comment, this is the journal freaking Nature. COVID lockdowns key to begin personal carbon allowances. Quote, restrictions on individuals that were unthinkable only a year before have us more prepared to accept tracking and limitations to achieve a safer climate. This was a 2021 report, Journal Nature Sustainability. COVID response, a template for climate. Oh, okay, so again, am I making mountains out of molehill? This is 230 medical journals, are the mainstream ones. Climate lockdowns, climate is the greatest threat to public health. Declare COVID-19 response to be a template for the climate response. Now think about that. Bypassing democracy, akin to Chinese one-party rule. I guess you would call it, what did Tom Friedman call it? One-party democracy is what you call it. In other words, we're going to do what the hell we want. It's good for you. Don't you dare question or challenge us. You will go nowhere and be happy. That's Business Insider on the left, mainstream publication. Electric vehicles won't save us. We need to get rid of cars completely. Oh my gosh. Okay, that's a crank publication. How it happened. Wait a minute. Boris Johnson's transportation secretary, his Pete Buttigieg, said owning a car is outdated 20th century thinking. We must move to shared mobility to cut carbon emissions. They're telling us out loud that they want to get rid of private car ownership. They consider the cars absolutely evil to the climate. Their ideology doesn't allow it. They want us in mass transit. Shut up and take a bus, peasants. Corporate government collusion. Look at this. Corporate Australian bank announces it will ban loans for gas-powered cars in order to fight climate change and encourage electric vehicles. So even if you want to buy a gas-powered car, if they're somehow not banned by corporate government collusion, and there's no vote on, by the way, no vote, no one voting. There's no switchboards on Capitol Hill aren't voting on the Green New Deal. They're not voting on banning gas-powered cars. They're not voting on banning meat. They're not voting on banning high-yield agriculture. They're not voting. They didn't vote on closing schools or canceling weddings and funerals or stay-at-home orders or businesses or closing churches. None of that happened. It was one-party democracy. We know what's best for you. We are that, like Tom Friedman said at Chinese leadership, the reasonably enlightened group of people who know what's best for society. We need to trust the experts. So look at this. Corporate banks announcing that they're not going to give out car loans for gas-powered cars. California I mentioned this earlier. Colorado, they're enacting emergency ban on new gas stations. So even if you have the car, even if you got financing for your gas-powered car, guess what? You're going to be facing gas station shortages as these nuts take over and start banning the creation of gas stations. So this is, when you're talking about the transportation, you'll go nowhere, baby. This is borrowing from Cuba and East Germany. On the left, you see Cuba. That's all the 1950s cars. By banning gas-powered cars, Gavin Newsom did it. Then it went to the California Air Resources Board, unelected bureaucracy. Then about 20 states trigger law, including my state of Virginia. We can't stop it because there's a Democrat that owns one of the branches, even though we have a Republican governor. So right now, Virginia is slated to ban gas-powered cars because we're following the reasonably enlightened group of people in California when they trigger law to follow whatever California deems good on the environment. We follow from our previous governor who signed us up to that. But we're literally looking at a situation where we're going to have a distorted used car market a la Cuba. And on the right, I have the East German Trabant. Now, what is this? Why am I showing that? These EV mandates and the bans on gas-powered cars are bringing back Eastern Germany, Eastern Bloc, communist rule. Erich Honecker, the East German dictator, they literally had only one government-approved car you could buy. The crappy East German Trabant. You'd be on waiting lists for 5, 10. I've talked to Germans, could be 12 years or longer. Now we're creating intentional car shortages by banning gas-powered cars, mandating electric. The Biden administration, by the next 9 years, wants electric car sales to go from 6% to 67%. California wants it to go from all the way to 100%, essentially, with these electric cars. You have government saying there's only one approved car you can get. They're intentionally creating car shortages. They're intentionally trying to force more people onto mass transit, city bus, subways. And once you force people there, you can shut those down a lot easier, the next pandemic or a climate emergency. And you can force people to vax and mask up. If you don't have a private car anymore, and that's where they're headed, and if you don't have gas stations where you can get gas and you couldn't finance it, guess what? You're taking the bus or the subway, and guess what? You can't take that if you're not in good standing with whatever the government is dictating. What booster are you at for COVID? This is the world in which we face. The great food reset. There was worry. Now look at this. China's buying up American farms. Washington wants to crack down. Oh my gosh. There's a Chinese-owned agricultural land monopoly. What could be worse than China owning so much American farmland? I can't think of anything worse. We have to stop this. Hold on. Hold the thing. I'm here to report that a homegrown American, Mr. Bill Gates, has beat China. Yeah, a homegrown American has sent China packing. And Bill Gates is now America's single largest farmland owner. And this is according to NBC News. So don't say, where did you get that? Oh, is that Alex Jones told you that? No, NBC News, you moron. Bill Gates is not the one in overalls. He's not the one on the tractor doing the farming. He's the landlord here on the farms. That's NBC News investigative reporter April Glasser. So just to be clear, this isn't like Green Acres where Bill Gates is out there in overalls and Mr. Haney's selling him an old rusty tractor. This is Bill Gates buying up family-run small farms that aren't able to meet the climate compliance and all the net zero rules, going bankrupt, all the hard times, post-COVID, gobbling up farmland. And why would Bill Gates want to own all this farmland? I mean, is he just like farming? Does he want to feed the world? Is he just that altruistic that he wants to make sure we eat? What could it be? Oh my gosh, there's his agenda. He wants the entire Western world to shift to synthetic beef. Now, in this context, he's talking about two things. He's talking about he's talking about the vegetable-based, like Impossible Burger made from all the processed vegetable oil, which even the CNN nutritionist said was disgusting and garbage and loaded with fat and not healthy. Better off eating a lean hamburger than one of these processed crap vegetable burgers, many times up to 25 different processed oil ingredients, which aren't even real vegetable oils. They're not really derived from a vegetable. But the other thing is Bill Gates has invested billions in lab-grown synthetic beef that's grown in steel vats from stem cells from a cow or lamb, put in with the fetal blood, and they're grown in these steel vats, and then you have to give antibiotics, you add coloring, you add texture, and eventually the World Economic Forum loves this about lab-grown meat. They're going to print them up on a 3D printer. And they brag about this. Israeli printers are working on this. You're going to print up this lab-grown meat in a paste, and it's going to come out in a 3D printer with the texture, the color, and allegedly the taste of real beef. And that way, we don't need to have cows or any animal livestock anymore. So maybe that's why Bill Gates wants to have huge sway in our agricultural policy. Bill Gates and Virgin Atlantic, what's his name? Richard Branson is another investor in this lab-grown meat. And there's more on this. They're test tube steaks, you could call them, as what test tube meat. You can change the behavior of people as they regulate. I love this quote from Bill Gates. Eventually, the green premium is modest that you can sort of change the behavior of people or use regulation to totally shift the demand. Using regulation to shift the demand. In other words, if you create meat shortages, you can shift the demand for people to eat lab-grown in a steel vat meat. You can shift the demand to force people to eat insects as a alternative source of protein. Keep in mind, they're telling us about the food crisis. The food crisis is non-existent. Crop yields, you know, this time have gone up as CO2 has risen. NASA's talked about the greening of the earth. Deserts are greening. Nothing to do with our climate, but climate policy is intentionally creating food crisis. The United Nations admitted that the COVID lockdowns created one of the greatest food shortages in the developing world that we'd seen in decades. I mean, this is governments have created this through policy. It's not climate. And so let's go back. You can use regulation to totally shift the demand. So you see how that works? They're going to make shortages of cars, shortages of energy, shortages of food, and then they can shift the demand. So you'll be forced to take mass transit, forced to eat lab-grown meat, forced to eat insects, forced to endure blackouts and not have constant electricity as we get. And by the way, South Africa, I'll get to that energy later about South Africa, but World Economic Forum, fake meat from a printer. You can print up to, 6 kilograms of meat an hour. Honey, what's for dinner? Oh, I don't know. I'm printing it up on the printer now. Ooh, that looks good. What is it? Oh, it's Bill Gates' latest lab-grown meat. The steel vat just released the meat, and we should be able to eat about as soon as the printer's done printing. Yummy. This is what they're literally talking about. Can we have a side of crickets with that lab-grown meat? All right, hold on. I'm having a little computer's freezing up here. I think it's freaking out. Okay. So, good grub, World Economic Forum. Why we might be eating insects soon. Eat the bugs. Now, why would we be eating insects? Very simply, they're collapsing livestock meat as a protein source. This is their stated goal. This is what they're trying to do. This is why if you go out, I got an $18 bag of beef jerky. I love beef jerky. I was traveling, I think in Pennsylvania, and I couldn't believe it. $18. I've never paid anything close to that in my life. You go to a restaurant, you try to order a nice steak, they're $80, and even modest restaurants now, it's working. They're creating meat shortages and making it more expensive, which then forces us to consider eating things like that. So the Wall Street Journal, the corporate mouthpiece of Wall Street, has another solution. To save money on food, just skip breakfast. So these are the simple things we can do. The merging of COVID and climate. This is the next area, and this is huge. Harvard School of Public Health. The root causes of climate change also increase the risk of pandemics. We need to take climate action to prevent the next pandemic. The Harvard School of Public Health, again, not some obscure blogger, not some, I didn't get an Extinction Rebellion activist. Oh, look, I got him to say it, and now I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. No, the Harvard School of Public Health is telling us that an unchecked climate change will lead to more COVID-like viruses. So if you don't support the Green New Deal or the UN Paris Climate Pact, you are a grandma killer. That's what they're telling us, the Harvard School. And we're not done. Climate homicide. By the way, there's also a paper in the journal Nature. There's all these peer-reviewed papers. Climate homicide. They've come up with this phrase, prosecuting big oil for climate death. Now, we both know that climate-related deaths have dropped 99% in the last 100 years. But somehow climate homicide is now a thing, creating climate deaths. So we're going to prosecute and charge people. You drove your car. You filled up a tank of gas. Your MasterCard will be cut off because you've maxed your carbon footprint. You are not going to be able to use your credit card because the central bank digital currency has cut you off. And now we're charging you with climate homicide for using too much gas. Don't worry. because now doctors are diagnosing patients with climate change. This is a doctor in British Columbia, head of the emergency room department, who's now joined with at least 30 other doctors, a growing movement. They're clinically diagnosing patients as suffering from climate change. In this case, it was the first patient ever, a woman suffering from heat stroke. She didn't have heat stroke. She was suffering from climate change. Also, if that's not enough, when the doctor, you can be charged with climate homicide for climate deaths. You can then be diagnosed with climate change. Guess what? When you die, your death certificate can now say you died from climate change. You see how that works? You can be charged with climate change. You can be diagnosed by a doctor with climate change. And when you die, your death certificate will reflect that you died of climate change. This is the world in which we're living. And by the way, this was a peer-reviewed study. This was a major Australian national university. Again, I didn't get an Extinction Rebellion activist to say this in some off-the-cuff interview, some 19-year-old activist. These are the organs of our society today, of the corporate, academic, government, ruling class. They're saying this not as an aberration. They're saying this in unison. They're saying it as loud as they can. They're saying it in peer-reviewed journals. They're saying it in their corporate media outlets. They're saying it through the World Health Organization, through the United Nations, through the World Economic Forum. They're saying it through the biggest universities we have. They're saying it through the medical journals, 230. Everything I'm telling you, this is the mainstream screaming and telling you exactly what they're planning. I've already mentioned this. The climate reality is that even though you can be charged, a 99% drop since 1920 of climate-related deaths. Now, the scary thing coming up, Omicron, this is the Washington Post. The Washington Post is calling the World Health Organization's call for a pandemic treaty, quote, a radical pandemic treaty. That's the Washington Post headline. Joe Biden is all in on this. They're trying their hardest. This will give Bill Gates-funded scientists at the WHO, if the United States signs on to us, you think the UN Paris Agreement, that was nothing. This is going to have the force of public health. And we saw how powerful public health can be, even under a supposedly conservative Republican president like Donald Trump. By the way, I argue that if Hillary Clinton had been president instead of Donald Trump, you would have had massive pushback in America. But the fact that Donald Trump was president, people accepted it. The same way as if, imagine if Hubert Humphrey had won in 1968 and or McGovern, when Nixon went to China and normalized relations, a Democrat president never would have got away with it because people on partisan grounds would have opposed it. Hillary Clinton never would have got away with what Donald Trump did by allowing these lockdowns and emergency decrees and rushing the vaccine, because on partisan grounds, there would have been natural opposition. So something to think about. Not arguing Hillary should have won. I'm saying Trump needs to own up for his failings on COVID. So the Washington Post pandemic treaty gives a Bill Gates-funded science the ability to declare a pandemic, and we could have global instant lockdowns, a ban on travel. I've watched, in my book, The Great Reset, I go through great detail of these event scenarios from 2010, 2017 by Rockefeller Foundation, by the World Economic, by Johns Hopkins, all literally laying out how they were going to plan this out. And they were talking about shutting down the global internet to prevent misinformation. This is the kind of power the Biden administration is eagerly trying to get. In fact, the Biden administration wants more strict measures than even the WHO's proposing for this pandemic treaty. And this is ongoing. We have to fight this. And Republicans in Congress seem to be clueless on this. Next up, your kids. This is the Vogue magazine. Is having a baby pure environmental vandalism? This is what they think of kids. This is why the overpopulation is such a big issue. If you do have kids, only short kids are allowed. Now, what did I get? Was this some wacky activist or someone said this and I saw a sign at a climate rally? No. This is in the freaking pages of the New York Times. There's never been a better time to be short. Mate with shorter people for a greener planet to save the planet by shrinking the needs of subsequent generations. The New York Times printed this. Speechless after all this nonsense? Well, don't worry, because we have a reason. Climate change is the cause. Peer-reviewed study, impact of climate change on language loss. It's accelerating our language loss. So if you can't find the word to describe everything I've just laid out, blame it on climate change. So in conclusion, we must keep calm and trust the experts, because the New York Times, again, not some wacky professor, whatever, the New York Times is claiming critical thinking leads to misinformation. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Critical thinking, as we're taught to do it, isn't helping in the fight against misinformation. Don't think for yourself. Forbes magazine, you must not do your own research when it comes to science. Why would you? Well, Anthony Fauci represents the science of COVID, and of course the UN represents the science of climate. Trust them. You can't oppose them anyway, because if you do, you're automatic misinformation. So don't do your own research when it comes to science. And this is my favorite. Questioning authority it has become too much of a good thing. It's killing people. If you challenge any assertion by the government, public health, climate establishment, you are murder on your hands. You are a climate criminal, climate homicide you could be charged with. Slate magazine, it's time to give up on facts, or at least temporarily lay them down. How about 2 weeks to flatten the facts in favor of a more useful weapon? What weapon is more useful than facts? Emotions. There you go. And let's go back to Greta Thunberg. I want you to panic. She doesn't want us to think. She wants us to panic, because thinking leads to facts, and they want us to think with emotions. So I call it the great resist or the great reject. This is what we need to do. This is what I believe you should be talking to your friends when they come up and say, hey, how do you talk to someone who believes in conspiracy theories? You need to apologize to them and tell them they were right. It's that simple. So I'm with Committee for Constructive Tomorrow. My website's Climate Depot. My book is The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. I lay all this out. I have like 90 pages of footnotes. I try not to be, what's the word? I don't even care about my opinion. I lay out the facts for you, and it's a fun book. This is not a wonky, boring book. I got George Carlin in here. I got Bill Maher jokes. I got book opens up with Rod Serling from the Twilight Zone. I go through a whole just spectrum. And I tried to make this a fun, entertaining book with little breakout boxes and other things. I think you'll really enjoy it. This is the book. There's 2 other major books out on the Great Reset. One is Glenn Beck and one is Alex Jones. I've read all 3 books, wrote one, obviously, and read the other 2. I can honestly say, I think mine is a much deeper book, much more comprehensive, and much more entertaining. Now, I might be biased. I plead guilty. But anyway, so that's that. And that's how you can contact me. Thank you very much, Tom. And any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
What is the best way that we can fight the central bank digital currency?
Well, the biggest thing with central bank digital currency is that, again, the fix is in. The Biden administration did their executive order last year. This is corporate government collusion. It's in league with the same forces that have been doing ESG, all the equity asset firms. The idea is they don't need, again, this is the reason you don't see the Green New Deal being passed. It was introduced in Congress, reintroduced actually recently, but there's no scheduled vote. There's no hearings. There's no town halls. Switchboards aren't lighting up. So the way to fight this is what's actually happening. And the good news here is Republican states, their attorney generals are literally filing, their governors, places like Florida, I believe Texas, Louisiana. They're actually banning in South Dakota, the Kristi Noem, ban the creation and use of central bank digital currency. We have to fight this on any piecemeal, meaning at all these state levels and local level, because then it's going to be harder and harder for them to impose it. And then we can tie it up in the courts at the very least, that the federal governments try to overrun the state rules. That's one of the biggest things. And you have to allow people to realize this. The biggest thing to look at is just look at Canada. What Justin Trudeau did to the Freedom Convoy, if you want to know what a central bank digital currency would look like, where the government is in charge and can tell corporations what to do. Justin Trudeau literally picked up the phone with these truckers who were protesting the vaccine and the mask mandates and all the lockdowns, and he declared them under the Canadian Emergency Act, first time in the history of Canada was ever used, declared them domestic terrorists. He called up the bankers and said, I want you to cut off access to these truckers, to their own money. Not like we'll cut off government services, we'll cut off their government programs. We're going to cut off access so they don't have access to their own money. That is central bank digital currency. You could go to the grocery store one day and it'll say, sorry, your transaction has been declined for milk, eggs, and bread because you have to remove the hate speech or the misinformation you have on social media and you can't use your money. So we have to educate people and we have to keep doing what we're doing. I'm really excited about the parent rebellion, and it goes beyond just central bank digital currency, but this had to do with transgender, critical race, and the COVID theater in school, the masking, the angry parents who, again, in the United States were declared domestic terrorists by our government. They literally created a sea change in my home state of Virginia. we toppled the Democrat Party machine of Terry McAuliffe, to the point where after that election, the Democrat National Party did focus groups, and I include this in the book. The New York Times reported that these focus groups so spooked the Democratic Party in the election, not only in Virginia, but in New Jersey, a couple other states where the COVID pushback was strong, led by parents. By the way, parents at the lowest level of politics, the school board level, were the most consequential in pushing back on the whole COVID lockdown and in the narrative. And what happened was the Democratic Party realized the folly of this and realized their own base didn't support these mandates anymore. So within weeks of this focus group, and I include this in the book, every major city from San Francisco, LA, Chicago, Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston lifted their mask and vax mandates because elections have consequences and angry parents at school board meetings have consequences. People willing to get arrested, people willing to be labeled and investigated and threatened. That was an incredible sight to see. And I think the message for next time, anything COVID, but the message for now as well, we can't wait for people to rise up. I think early on in COVID, I was one of them, like, there's no way people are going to accept this. There's going to be resistance. Never came. We need to lead it next time, and we need to come out immediately. And again, it would have been a lot easier if Hillary had imposed those, the emergency order and the lockdowns and even did a vaccine warp speed, which was the worst thing Trump could have done, rushed a vaccine that was later used as a mandate. But anyway, so that is a big one coming. The cashless central bank digital currency is huge because that's going to be government only deemed. They'll control, that'll be total control of your life for finances. And of course, you can always avoid it with barter and trade, but it's going to get increasingly hard with all the track and trace and all the lack of privacy that they're promoting as well.
And then speaking of leading the resistance, I'm interested in what you think about RFK Jr. because there is an interview out there, and I think it's you doing the interview where he's being asked if climate skeptics should be thrown in jail, and he was saying yes. But has he flipped? What do you think?
Well, a good question. In my book, I gave him full pardon. I said all is forgiven. I interviewed him in 2014. He said that climate deniers, especially the CEOs of energy companies like the Koch brothers or anything else, should belong at The Hague with 3 square meals and a cot. That was my interview 2014 at the New York City Climate March. I then asked him about politicians like Senator Inhofe, who I used to work for. And he said, I wish we could put them in jail, but there isn't a law which we could do it, but I wish we could do that. Really over the top. Now, since that time, I think he's been red-pilled on a lot of different issues, but particularly on the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, because he became the leading voice against the exact same policies in COVID that could have been applied to the climate world. And I went through all the similarities. So I knew there was no way RFK could ever hold that same climate position. Well, he just came out recently with an interview on Kim Iverson's show, and he said that the climate agenda has been hijacked by the World Economic Forum and the UN as a mechanism of control by the same forces that use COVID. So he now gets it. And he actually said something else cheerfully good. He said, regardless of your view on whether CO2 causes climate, I believe in free markets solving, environmental problems, et cetera. So very encouraging. However, I still don't know. I still part ways with him when he talks about the air pollution and all the allegedly all the harm. Because if you look at it, even the mainstream sources of media admit that since the first Earth Day, we've so radically improved air, water quality. Even the World Health Organization says the U.S. is among the cleanest in the world. I think he's going after trace elements of effects in the atmosphere that I don't even know if we could actually, how much more we could actually reduce them. So I don't know. I'm not that comfortable with his energy policy, but I am, even if I disagree with him on climate science, I am now very happy to see him talking about the climate agenda being used, because that was a huge thing. And I've already tweeted out, I'm having some fun with it. My RFK, Donald Trump, DeSantis, or Vivek Ramaswamy are my only candidates I'd consider voting for. But we'll see how this develops, how RFK evolves. Again, who would have thought Naomi Wolf or Jimmy Dore or Russell Brand, I would be watching them daily and agreeing with 90% of what they say.
Yeah, interesting. And my third and final question is, do you have it straight in your head how the org chart looks, or how the flow of power goes with the WEF and the UN? Because I'm hearing people say the WEF is just a marketing arm and that's not where the power is. What do you think?
Well, it's a good question, because people say, and I've done talks and everything where they're like, they'll tell you that the real power, that these are all front groups, everything from the UN, that the real power essentially is the military industrial complex that keeps this all going and a few billionaires. That's a really heady question that people could debate. And you've always had that, who's really in control. As you go back, I go through the book and I say throughout history, the ruling classes have always tried to invent ways why the rest of us can't be free. So in that case, you have to look at who benefits. And it really is, again, sounding like Bernie Sanders, it really is the top 1%. It's the 1% of the billionaires, multimillionaires, and corporations who then own and control the government, and then the government owns and controls the corporation. So in my book, I actually talk about in this new sort of equity asset world in which we live, where we have equity asset firms that are larger than the entire United States economy. I use the example of Coke and Pepsi. So my point is, it's hard to answer, but I use the example of Coke and Pepsi. If you look at it, they look like they're two different companies competing. You say, oh, which one's better? Coke is competing with Pepsi. But then if you look deep into it, and I feature the analysis, they're actually owned by the same people, the same equity asset, the same funders and investors. So in the end, who really controls Coke and Pepsi? Are they really two different entities? So these are harder questions to answer. And, these are almost philosophical, what you're asking for me. I don't have any real good answer, but I do touch on that in the book. But I don't have a definitive answer for you here today on that.
Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap up?
No, the only thing I was going to say is there's been such a insane amount of news this past week. And I was just going to run through a couple things real quick, just to show you how rapidly everything is. Just to give you an example, the green agenda right now, China is now surpassing US, South Korea has become the world's #1 auto exporter, #1 automaker because of this green agenda. We're helping China. CBS News just did a segment highlighting how adding bugs to the food system is a game changer for the climate. A Swiss billionaire-backed environmental group is spending big money targeting Biden voters. So we're getting foreign interference again there. This was the most shocking story of the week. Bloomberg News. Notice how I'm always citing mainstream sources. Actual headlines. South Africa beats climate goal as blackouts/emissions. Unintentional power plant breakdowns are reducing industrial activity. Remember when the UN said that we need to shut down the global economy? That's what they're doing in South Africa. They're intentional blackouts by the climate agenda is making that they're a climate hero country now. They're meeting the climate goals through blackouts of suffering people. And then one other thing, this was the most shocking story of the week. The BBC, this is just a random week, Tom. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That's why when I include the presentation, it's hard to even believe what I had to settle on because there's so much. I'm just touching the top surface. This is this week. Here it is. BBC, actual headline. What would a flying free world look like? Fresh fruits and veggies would disappear from supermarkets in winter. Huge adjustment in supply chains. It's not about when, it's about when, not if we have a flying free world. In this article, it's called the BBC Future division of the BBC News. They lay out how airports will be abandoned under a net zero world, and they'll be turned into skate parks and community centers because people won't be flying anymore. They're creating a vision of a world where only the wealthy will be able to travel, only be able to afford to fly. In fact, Bloomberg News also had an article about a month ago, spring of 2023, about how cheap airline flights are a thing of the past due to climate compliance, in quotes, regulations. So this is happening. Unbelievable. Just to repeat, collapsing food, energy, transportation, and they're doing it in our face with every major organ. None of it's hidden. I didn't cite secret documents. I don't have, a secret source in the government who I can't reveal the name. Everything I'm telling you is mainstream. So that's what's happening right now. And in many ways, I feel like Kevin McCarthy, the actor in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. They're here, running through the streets trying to warn people. But, that's where we are right now. But thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. That was great. I really enjoy listening to you speak, and I appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Tom. I appreciate it. Good to talk
to you next time. Goodbye.
All right. Thanks.